Hi, this is Mrs. Solomon, and this is the beginning of our study in the book of Genesis. This is our second unit, um, and we are specifically going over the primeval story contained in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Specifically, this lesson is on the creation accounts contained in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And yes, there does appear to be two creation accounts, so that is our topic of discussion today. So here are our assumptions as we go through. We are not approaching this from a scientific point of view. As we've discussed in class, the ancient Israelites did not have the same scientific knowledge that we have, and so we can't approach it from that point of view, since they were not indeed trying to dictate to us science, but they were sharing how they believed God was working in their world, and so we're not going to approach it from that viewpoint. In addition to that, the creation account is not an apologetic to defend creationism over against evolution, because Genesis was written to the people of God, to worshipers of God, by fellow worshipers of God. And so the issue of evolution doesn't come into play here, at least in my opinion, because once again it goes to the first point. We are not approaching this from a scientific point of view. The ancients were not trying to relay science. They were trying to relay how God was working in their world and how he got things going, how he created things, and how he got things the way they were to them. Okay. The third is that there are mysteries which we can't answer. There are questions that we can't answer. Very often we talk about Satan and, according to Christianity, his fall in judgment. We can't answer those questions in the Genesis text either, considering, number one, the concept of Satan does not appear in the Hebrew Bible the way Christians look at it. So some things we can't answer, and we sort of have to accept that. We can definitely ask the question, but we can't answer everything. The fourth thing, we need to study it in its study the Genesis accounts of creation in their historical context, and we will absolutely do that. And we will attempt to apply it to our lives, even though it does have a particular historical context. So, if you have not done so, begin reading Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 4a, and a is the first half of verse 4. So stop and read that account right now. This is what is referred to as the first creation account. All right, so you've read it. As you can see here, the account starts out by saying, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." That face of the deep and the waters, that and the formless void, that has to do with what is referred to as chaos. This idea of chaos existing at the beginning of time, when the world began, this disordered state of unformed matter that existed before the universe was ordered. That is what's being talked about here, this idea of chaos. And it is an idea that we also see in Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek creation traditions, that there was just this stuff that existed, and this stuff that was ordered, that was unordered, that was chaotic, that in other ancient Near Eastern traditions, that chaos represents the gods or a god. In the biblical creation account, that chaos doesn't represent a god or gods, nor does it represent God himself. Chaos is just mere matter that is in a state of formlessness. It is in a state that has to be put into some order. And so, as it stands here, if you look at the text, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, stuff was still there. So, according to many scholars, you can't say that God created out of nothing. There's a term for that, creatio ex nihilo, that comes from the Latin, that it appears as though that God, in fact, created out of something, that there was indeed something there. And It's that chaos that God had to put in order. So that's what we have at the beginning of this creation account, this first creation account. I want to invite you that as you are reading the text, particularly if you have your HarperCollins Study Bible, that as we are going along, that you read along with the notes that are in your HarperCollins Study Bible. Remember, those notes come below that gray horizontal line on each page, and there are so many notes that are there that can help you in your understanding, and that is where I take much of what I'm telling you. That's where I take a lot of what I lecture from. So make sure you're making use of those notes. Okay, so we're working under this assumption that God is creating out of something, that He is creating out of this chaos. But what really is it that He is doing? What He is doing here is He is separating stuff and He's ordering it. Because remember, the only thing that was in the universe were these waters, okay, and these chaotic waters. And so it appears that's what's happening is when you read how God created, and I'm not going to ask you to enumerate for me and number for me on what days did God create what, because we can read that in the text. But on days 1 through 3, as you can see, God creates these domains. He creates light. He creates a dome that separated the waters. So the waters were separated, waters beneath and waters above, using a dome. He says specifically in verse 6, and this is on verse 2, on day 2, where he says, "And God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." Well, if you take a look at the notes for the HarperCollins in chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, look down at the bottom of the page. It says dome, made of hard material that shines like ice or crystal, and the dome separation of the waters is later reversed in the flood when the windows in the dome are open. So if you can take a look here at this diagram, this is what is referred to as a cosmology. A cosmology is a model of the structure of the physical universe. And this is what scholars deem the cosmology of Genesis chapter 1 to be. So those chaotic waters were separated by a dome. And so you have the waters above and then the waters beneath here, the seas, the waters, the ocean below. And so you have the light as a domain, the dome as a domain that separated the waters from the waters. So in essence, you have the sky or the waters above and the waters below as a domain. And then you have dry land and vegetation. Another word for domain that we can use here is like a container. So in days 1 through 3, God creates the containers out of the chaos, out of the stuff. And then in days 4 through 6, He creates more stuff to populate those domains, or He creates stuff to put in the containers. So He puts the sun and the moon and the stars in the domain where the light is. And He puts the birds in the domain where the sky is, because the waters were separated from the water, so you've got sky, and so the birds can fly there. And then you've got fish that are housed in the domain of the waters below. And then animals and humanity created on those last days that habitated that dry land, and humanity able to habitate vegetation and eat the vegetation that's provided. So this is essentially what it looks like. Here's the dome. And if you actually take a look, if you go outside on a very clear day, on a day where there are not many clouds and the sky is just blue, you will actually see it. If you look up, it actually looks like a dome. Well, that was their science. That's the only way that they could explain how it is that the stars were in the sky. The light gave light to the stars. The light illumined the sun. The light illumined the moon. And so that's why you have the bodies of light orbiting this dome. Okay, I know it doesn't make sense because you say, well, no, the light doesn't come first. How is that? Remember, there are always questions that the text cannot answer. And remember, we're talking not about science, but how the ancient Hebrews saw God working in their world. Okay, so the creation, this first creation account is about separating, it's about ordering. Days 1 through 3, God makes a container. Days 4 through 6, God creates the stuff that's put in the container. All right, on that sixth day, we've got the creation of human beings. And as you can see here, starting in verse 6, then God said, let us make humankind in our image. And then you can see the rest of the passage there. This is God's last and climactic work of creation. This is the pinnacle of what he's been doing over these days. Want to point you out to something though. It says, then God said, let us make humankind in our image. That us could be a number of things. Not a number of things, but a few things. It could be referring to a royal we, where God is talking to himself. But in the ancient Near East, there's this concept of the divine assembly or the divine council, which are lesser divine beings. And you see that all throughout the ancient Near East. Remember that ancient Israel comes out of this same context, and so it is more likely that us is referring to the lesser beings of the divine council. However, to keep in mind, God acts alone. So when he says, let us make humankind in our image, it's sort of like he's in a boardroom with these lesser beings around the table. But he's not asking for approval, and he's not even asking for help. He is just saying, we're going to create humankind in our image. And so he is acting alone with this. Whereas with other ancient Near Eastern accounts, creation is sometimes, or humanity is sometimes created with the consultation of other gods and other lesser beings. And so that is one of the things that distinguishes the Israelite account from other ancient Near Eastern accounts. And we'll look at some of those distinctions during class. Also, as you can see, not only is God sort of consulting with the divine council when he says, let us, but notice what he says. He says, let us make humankind in our image. And so we have this image of God concept. In the biblical text, the image of God concept in Genesis is central to the biblical understanding of the nature of humanity. But what really does it mean? If you take a look at the text, he says, let them have dominion over the fish of the air, fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of these things. Remember that what God does, he is the ultimate creator, he is the ultimate ruler. But by him saying, let them have dominion over the fish of the air and all of these other things, what he is calling forth is that humanity represent and implement God's rule on earth. So being created in the image of God, while it can have all sorts of connotations in terms of emotion, in terms of intellect, maybe in terms of physicality, although that's more unlikely because we don't know what God looks like. In this context, what he has done is said humanity is created to model God's ruling function, to model how he rules the entire universe. Humanity is going to rule on the earth. So that's something to keep in mind, that in being created in the image of God, in this context is more a function and what God is calling humanity to do as being rulers over everything on the earth. Interestingly enough, after he created humanity, he says, the text says in verse 28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. So not only are they to have dominion and rule on the earth, but they are also called to grow and be fruitful and multiply. That is the sign of God's blessing. So as you can see at the end of creation, everything is very good at the end of the sixth day.